I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest is former State Senator Bill Stevens. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you
We're
for
glad
being
to
here.
have you. Bill, if I'm not mistaken, you and I have at least two things in common. We're both mountaineers, and we both played college basketball.
That's right. I played basketball at Gainesville College, believe it or not, at 5'10" in height, and played basketball back in the mid-'70s at Gainesville College.
Well, you've had a long and successful career in politics, but before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about your early life.
Okay.
Canton County, Georgia.
Well, I was born in Blue Ridge in Canton County and grew up in Morganton, Georgia, population 305 on a good day, and grew up there and went to Little Bitty High School. Had 32 people in my graduating class and went off to play basketball at Gainesville College, and then went on to the University of Georgia for a couple of years, and then graduate school at Georgia State. But I grew up in Canton County, which is one of the most Republican counties in the country. And my family has been involved in the political world there for over 50 or 60 years, with my mother being mayor of my hometown.
Yeah, she's been mayor of Morganton for a long time. Let's talk for a minute about political philosophy. How would you define yours?
Well, I'm a mountain Republican, I guess I'd say. And people will say, well, what is that? And I'd say that's somebody that believes that government ought to stay out of your business as much as possible, believe in smaller government, believe that folks ought to take personal responsibility for themselves, and a lot of that's reflected in the Scotch-Irish heritage growing up in the mountains, just like you did.
Right. You know, former Governor Zell Miller likes to tell the story about you showing up at his door one night when he was a candidate for lieutenant governor and asking to help him, and he told you that he didn't have any money to pay you, so you said you'd just do it for nothing.
Yeah, I was young and foolish at the time. No, seriously, I believed in Governor Miller, then Lieutenant Governor Miller, and what he was doing, and he was running for governor at the time. I really believed in him as a fellow mountaineer and as a friend of the family, and really wanted to help him in the worst way. And I had an opportunity to do that, and hopefully had some impact in helping him get elected governor. And I'm very proud of that period of life.
Was that your first venture into politics?
Well, I think probably my first venture into politics was a mock election at Morganton Elementary School in 1966, when we had a mock election there, and they had to pick somebody to play Bo Calloway and somebody to play Lester Maddox, and I played Bo Calloway. And I won that election. Of course, Bo Calloway lost that election once it got to the Georgia General Assembly later that year. So I was about 10 years old at the time. That was my first foray into politics.
You didn't stuff the ballot box, did you?
No, sir, I didn't.
Okay, you were in the Miller administration. Tell us about that.
Well, I started with Governor Miller as an aide in the lieutenant governor's office, and actually worked for him for a number of legislative sessions from about 1981 to 1989. And then in '89 I went full time, and I walked into his office one Friday afternoon and said, well, Governor, I'm here to do what you want me to do. And he said, well, I want you to kind of be my political director like we discussed, but the guy was going to hire as spokesperson is not going to take the job. So why don't you do that for a couple of weeks? Well, 2 weeks became 3 years, and I became his spokesperson and served there in the lieutenant governor's office then in the first few months of his administration, also as director of communications.
So you're involved in the lottery?
Yes. And the lottery, I was there in the room with a small number of people when the notion of a lottery for education first came up. On January 5th, 1989, I helped write the first press release that mentioned a lottery for education in Georgia. A lot of people don't know this, but the original name of the scholarship, we played around with a lot of different names, and one of them was HELP, helping educational leaders progress, but we discovered that then Governor Miller, Lieutenant Governor Miller, couldn't say the word help. He kept saying HEP, like we do up in the North Georgia mountains. So we then looked at other names and came up with the HOPE Scholarship. And that's kind of a interesting little aside as to how the name Hope came about.
That was a long and drawn-out process.
It was, and the lottery for education was opposed by many church groups and by a lot of folks in Georgia. But when you looked at the polling, you realized that that most Georgians were in favor of it, particularly when it was tied to education. And the original concepts for the lottery were not tied to education. They were tied to tax breaks for seniors or those kinds of things. But after looking at it, Governor Miller then decided that it ought to go for education, and he was correct in doing that.
Well, after leaving the governor's office, you were elected to the Georgia Senate, I believe in 1998.
That's correct.
What prompted that decision?
Well, my hometown state senator decided to run for Attorney General. David Ralston, who is now Georgia's, as we speak, Georgia's Speaker of the House, he was running for Attorney General at the time. There was an open state Senate seat. It included my hometown of Morganton and home county of Fannin and 4 other counties. And there were a couple of folks running that I thought were a little outside the mainstream and wouldn't care as much about my home county as I did. Mm-hmm. So be careful what you want, because I ran for it and won pretty handily, and I ended up serving in the Senate for 8 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, describe for us, if you will, the makeup of the state Senate when you got there in 1999.
Well, when I first got to the state Senate, it was a Democratic, very much Democratic controlled state Senate with 34, 35 votes for Democrats, and the other remaining number of the 56 were Republicans. And I was a backbench freshman senator with very little power at all other than the ability to get up and talk, I guess. And so it was very much a democratically controlled institution, and the lieutenant governor was a Democrat. Mark Taylor was lieutenant governor, just gotten elected lieutenant governor, and was a very powerful figure himself.
Mm-hmm. Well, you were soon chosen as chair of the Republican Caucus. What did you do as a chair?
Well, what happened was we had, at the end of my freshman term, we had an election, and a group of senators, some prominent senators like Sonny Perdue and Tom Price, and who's congressman now, and some others, Eric Johnson, who later ran for governor after he became pro tem of the Senate, decided we need some leadership changes. And they nominated me, or suggested that I run for Republican Caucus chair, and I ran on the platform of that we would take over the Georgia State Senate on my watch. The Republicans would become a majority, and that was what I ran on. And we set out and laid out a communication strategy and election strategy to do just that, and we're successful a couple of years later.
Well, 2002 was a historic year, not only in Georgia politics, but also for the Republican Party. That was the year that the voters elected Sonny Perdue, the first Republican governor since Benjamin Connolly, 131 years earlier.
That's right.
This had to be the high point of the Republican Party in Georgia.
Well, it was the beginning of a very high point, and the transition was a very interesting time then. Sonny was elected on a Tuesday, of course, in the election, a surprise election, defeating Governor Barnes by a pretty handy margin for lots of different reasons. And what followed in the days following that election were historic, and in terms of that was when the effort was made to take over the Georgia State Senate. At that time, Sonny Perdue would have faced a Democratic Senate and a Democratic legislature in general, House as well, of course. And we set out to take over the Georgia State Senate. So in the 3 or 4 days that followed the election of Sonny Perdue, he did kind of a victory lap of Georgia, going from city to city and speaking to crowds and all, but it really had a different purpose. It had the purpose of trying to convince 3 Democratic state senators to convert to the Republican Party, and in doing so, take over the Georgia State Senate. So we went around, a group of us, and led by Sonny, of course, and the new governor convinced these 3 Democratic senators to become Republicans, and we, at that point, then had a majority of 29 votes in the Georgia State Senate. And we're able then to come in and change the rules that removes a lot of the powers, the important powers, from the then sitting Lieutenant Governor, a Democrat, Mark Taylor. And so it was a very historic time, and it was the first, as you pointed out, the first time in 131 years that any body of the legislature had been controlled by Republicans.
I noticed that those Democrats who became Republicans retained their positions in the Senate. Was that some sort of a deal?
Well, it was. Yes, there are always deals in politics. The deals were that we would help them get reelected to their positions, of course, and that we'd put them in prominent positions as committee chairs and other things reflective of the amount of responsibility they'd had previously in the Senate. And we kept those promises, and they kept their promises, and they were reelected. But it was a very combative time, and a lot of very harsh feelings there, particularly left over from some redistricting that had happened. And so it was a very, very interesting time in Georgia.
Well, I want to get into redistricting a little later, but now I'd like to ask you about being the administration floor leader in the Senate for Governor Perdue.
Well, I became the first Senate Republican floor leader in Georgia in 131 years by virtue of being there at the right place at the right time, and represented the governor's interests in the Senate along with Senator Lee from down in Troup County, Senator Dan Lee. And the two of us took the lead in representing the governor in the Senate and all his legislation and his budget. And we were going through a deep recession at the time, and the budget was in disarray. And we were taking over from a Democratic governor, and we're using the old budget as a basis for what was becoming a new Republican budget. So it was a very interesting time. And as floor leader, we had the responsibility for passing that very controversial budget that had a tobacco tax in it and some other, but it had some tax breaks to offset that. It was very, again, a very combative time.
And also the flag.
Well, the flag we could probably spend a couple of hours on. I think if I learned any one thing in politics in Georgia, it's don't mess with symbols. I think Governor Miller learned that earlier and later in his career and early in his administration as well. But the flag fight went on for about 3 years in the General Assembly, culminating in the passage of a referendum and a vote on a flag that I think is a very handsome flag, and one that's very pretty and very, very similar to the original Confederate flag that we used to have when the Confederacy was first created. But it was a tough time, and they say the Civil War was brother against brother, and in the flag fight there was a lot of that as well. And it was there were some senators that lost their seat during that time for having voted one way or the other during the Barnes administration on the change of the flag. So,
getting back to that 2002 election, where Sonny Perdue defeated the incumbent Roy Barnes. Barnes said later that he thought the flag issue was what helped to defeat him. Now, if you go back to the Barnes handling of the flag, would you agree that's true?
I think it was a large factor. I really do. But I think it was only one of several factors. The way that they handled the flag legislation initially was to introduce it on a Thursday afternoon and try to pass it on a Friday and try to get it through before the weekend came up and people in Georgia could scream. And that wasn't successful, and it went over a weekend. And then the people of Georgia began to have their say, and it went on then for several more days, and I think there were a lot of people bitter at Governor Barnes because of that. But there became a number of groups that only had one thing in common. You had the teachers, the flag people, the folks that were against the Northern Arc, a project, transportation project in the northern suburbs, and a couple of other groups, they only had one thing in common, and that is they didn't want Governor Barnes reelected. So Sonny Perdue came along at just that time. And so you had a number, so the flag did have a lot to do, I think, with Governor Barnes losing, but it was more so just one factor in a combination of several that led to his defeat in that 2002 election.
So you agree with former Fulton County Sheriff Freeman, who once told me that Governor Barnes lost because he made everybody mad at the same time.
I think that's exactly right. As I said, there's only one thing most people had in common, that was they were mad at Roy Barnes. So,
well, it's also been said that the two most surprised people in the world the day after the election was Roy Barnes and Sonny Perdue.
I remember being there election night when Governor Perdue got the call from George W. Bush about his election and being in the room there. It was a very interesting time.
Well, let's talk now a little bit. We mentioned reapportionment, and you were active in that arena. In fact, I remember once you taking a trip through your district that was some 200 miles long.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I was active in reapportionment in a way I didn't want to be active, and that was I was one of the senators targeted in redistricting when Governor Barnes was governor, which is understandable. They were trying to carve up the state to hang on to Democratic control. And I ended up having a Senate district that was all or parts of 13 different counties in North Georgia, starting at Woodstock, heading north to the Tennessee border, cutting over through Towns and Union counties, coming down through the middle of Lake Chattooga, as you mentioned, and then over into Stevens County and Toccoa. So the only thing people in Toccoa and Woodstock had in common, really, was me as their state senator in terms of political interests. And so that's just one example. There were other state Senate districts that were also carved up, and it caused a lot of backlash. And I think that's another one of the factors that affected Governor Barnes' reelection, was the way redistricting was handled. So when Republicans took over the Senate and then eventually the House a couple of years later, we came back and did redistricting ourselves. And I think that we put counties back together. I ended up, instead of having 13 counties, parts of 13 counties, I ended up having 2 whole counties. And there were other senators that were in the same kind of situation. So we tried to restore as best we could, keeping political power, of course, the Senate maps to where they were representative of the people.
Some reporter once referred to redistricting in Georgia as dizzying. Now, those are not my words. My description would be always a hassle. Why is it so difficult? And why is it always so partisan?
Well, because it's the most raw exercise of political power, I think, that there is in our system. And that's the actual drawing of districts, when senators and representatives actually, instead of being picked by the people they represent, they're picking the people that they want to represent. And so maps are drawn that pit one person against another. There are examples of senators who had only their backyard in their district, and the rest of their district was brand new. And lines were just drawn in so many different ways that it did become dizzying. And it was quite exhilarating, I can say that too.
And it was always a hassle.
It was always a hassle, and one that I frankly wouldn't wish on anybody. If there are any number of things I like to do, if I could be doing things for Georgia for one single day without having to go through all the legislative hassle, and that would be to create an independent commission that would handle redistricting, because it's a real mess.
Well, I noticed that the Republican Party recently shifted responsibility for the details of reapportionment from the University of Georgia Benson Institute to a special office that is manned by Republicans.
Right.
You think that connotes partisanship?
Well, I don't agree with it personally. I think the Benson Institute was probably a good place to have it, frankly. But that's just the raw exercise of political power as it comes to redistricting, and that's just the way that it came about.
So I guess we can expect more jockeying among parties when we're forced to redistrict everything.
Well, from what I know about history, and I'm not an expert, but from what I've read about previous Georgia history and history in other states as well, it's been going on in the raw exercise of power for generations, and it'll probably continue.
Well, you authored several bold legislative measures and had a reputation built for finding wasteful government spending. Tell us about your Stuck Pig Award.
Well, I tried to create an award, and did create an award, designed to point out the worst single expenditure of state government funds that we could find in any one budget year. And Stuck Pig Award came about and was named because if you grew up on a farm as I did and you did, you know what a pig sounds like when it's stuck under a fence and can't get loose. It squeals. And so that represented, we had a little marble pig award made up that had a pig stuck under a gate and squealing. And that represented the bureaucrats and how they would squeal if you pointed out lousy expenditures of state funds. One of the first awards we gave was to the Department of Corrections for spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on holistic stress management for prisoners. We were saying that it probably is stressful to be in prison, but there's a reason for that. And it wasn't exactly an appropriate expenditure. And we had another award that we gave to the Department of Natural Resources for spending $85,000 constructing duck boxes on a lake in South Carolina, which is up on the Georgia-South Carolina border, of course. But we were trying to make the point that you don't know what those Georgia ducks are doing in those boxes, and up there in South Carolina. So who knows? And we pointed out expenditures like that, but it was designed to get the attention of the budget writers, and it did. And so every year, people would look towards what it was that we were going to point out was a crazy expenditure, and it became something that we could point to as a way to rein in crazy expenditures of state government.
Let's talk for a minute about the budget. There has been concern over the years that the budget spends too much time in the House and not enough in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with that?
I do agree with it. And of course, I'm prejudiced from the Senate side, but the courtesy of the Georgia Constitution, just as according to our national Constitution, the House is where these budgets start, and the Senate was always the weak sister when it came to the budget process until about 2002, 2003, when Republicans took over. We created a Georgia Senate budget office to rival the House budget office, and to actually give senators more insight into the actual budget and how it worked, and made an effort to get the budget quicker into the Senate body. And I think the Senate now has more power than it did when it comes to the budget, but the House still has 180 members and the Senate still has 56, and just the sheer numbers of people having input mean that it stays longer in the House than the Senate.
The budget in the final analysis winds up in the hands of a joint committee,
right,
composed of 3 people, 3 from the House,
right,
and 3 from the Senate. You served on that committee.
I did.
How were the differences in the budget resolved?
Well, as you pointed out, you had 3 senators and 3 representatives that served on a budget conference committee. So when everybody else was done with when all the other representatives and all the other senators were done, all the committees and everybody else was done with the budget process, then there were 6 of us that would gather publicly most of the time, privately some of the time, and actually make the final adjustments on the budget. And those final adjustments were based on policy sometimes. A lot of times they were based on politics, as you would expect. But the way the differences were resolved were just on a personal basis. Senators and representatives having an understanding of what their members wanted and what different parts of Georgia needed. The governor's office always had input, believe it or not, in those final negotiations, because Georgia has a very powerful governor's position in that governor, every Georgia governor actually presents the budget first out of the chute. And so that makes the governor's office a big player in the budget process all the way through. But at the end, the decisions were made on a personal and political basis.
So the Senate did not have a green door committee like the House.
Well, the Senate, we didn't call ours a green door committee. We had a committee of 3 people that did make final decisions and did accept input from other senators, of course. But there were 3 of us there that usually it was made up of the Senate Majority Leader, the President Pro Tem, and the Appropriations Committee Chair, and I think that's still the way it is now.
I guess we should define the green door. That was Speaker Murphy's special committee that finalized the budget in the House.
Mm-hmm.
And once that budget was finalized, they stuck to it as best they could throughout the process.
Yeah, the final vote's always an up and down vote. And you've often heard it said, and I know I've heard you say it before, and it's not an original thing, but there are 2 things in life you shouldn't watch being made. One is sausage and the other is the law. And in this case, it was not a very pretty process.
In the budgetary process, how much do we depend on the federal government for funding?
Well, Georgia, as does every state, just depends a lot on the federal government. I mean, our Medicaid budget is billions of dollars, and the majority of that comes from the federal government. And you also get some money for education from the federal government. So when you're talking about the Georgia state budget, which as we talk here today is about $19 billion in size is the way it's described, but really it's 30-something billion because you have to add the federal dollars on top of that, and that has to be appropriated as well. So federal dollars are crucial to the states and crucial to Georgia when it comes to the budgetary process.
How do you think we would fare without those federal funds?
Well, it would be tough, especially when it comes to health care. When balancing the budget, when those 6 people got together to balance the budget, the Green Door Committee, as you described them, it's not well known, but you can project how much roads are going to cost. You can project based on number of students how much education is going to cost. You can project how much special projects and other things that state government does will cost. But health care is almost impossible to project. So what would happen would be we would balance all those other numbers, and then whatever's left would be plugged into health care. And it was always a hit or miss proposition, mostly miss, because health care always ended up costing more than the budget writers thought it would cost. And so without those federal dollars coming in, it would be a real challenge for Georgia to be able to handle the Medicaid population, for instance.
As I recall, Bill, you only had one challenge during your Senate career.
I did.
And that was in, 2004?
Yes, sir.
Tell us about that campaign.
Well, it was a campaign right after redistricting. And again, here comes redistricting as a reason for political change in Georgia. I had 13 North Georgia counties, including where I grew up, to start with, and then I had 2 counties in just the suburbs. So I was challenged by a former Democrat turned Republican who had been a very prominent political player, Bubba McDonald. And he decided he would challenge me, and I was the sitting Senate Majority Leader, and we had a very tough campaign. I ended up winning with 60% of the vote, which I'm proud of, but it was a tough time. That was the only time I was really challenged at all when in my Senate career, and it was a very tough campaign, but it was one that I would suggest to you going through a tough campaign can teach you more than you would ever know about politics had you not had one.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we leave your Senate career, let's talk a minute, if you will, about what you feel were your greatest accomplishments.
Well, a couple I would suggest probably wouldn't be the ones that would come to mind. First of all, for people that I know, the first thing was I had a hand in, as the governor's floor leader in 2003, in doing the first methamphetamines bill believe it or not. Methamphetamines was a huge problem in North Georgia and still is. And as we sit here and talk, and I handled the first bill to address the methamphetamines labs and the situation about over-the-counter drug sales for drugs that were then used to make methamphetamines, and so we worked with the GBI to do that. So that's one accomplishment. The other accomplishment that I've mentioned very briefly would be in the area of the budget process, and that is simply the weeding out of crazy expenditures. We passed in Georgia. We have to have a balanced budget, of course, but I took a lead in examining the budget from top to bottom. Back before people talked about zero-based budgeting, we were trying to do that. So those are a couple of accomplishments that I would mention.
Well, after 8 years as a leader in the Senate, you decided to run for the office of Secretary of State.
Yes.
What prompted that decision?
Well, a couple of things. One, I had gone about as far as you could go in the Senate, and serving in the Senate takes a great toll on people, financially and otherwise. It's tough to serve in the Senate, and I'd reached the point where I thought I'd served long enough and it was time to give somebody else a shot at it. The Secretary of State's office was appealing because I love Georgia history, and that's the repository of the Georgia archives and the supervisor of elections and those things in Georgia that I really had taken a lot of interest in. And I'd co-authored the voter ID bill and some other things. And Secretary of State was a position that I was interested in running for, and I ran for it, lost in a runoff to the eventual winner. But it was quite an experience to run statewide in a state as big as this one. Mm-hmm. This is a huge and beautiful state. You make a lot of friends when you're running statewide, and I don't regret it for a minute.
The voter ID that you mentioned has become very controversial.
It has.
Is it, what should be done?
Well, I would suggest to you what we've done already is what should have been done, and that is just simply require a state ID of some sort for people when they show up at the polls, and it's done for everything from getting on an airplane flight to just getting in certain buildings at the University of Georgia. You got to have a photo ID, and we thought that was a reasonable expectation for voting in Georgia. And other states have copied that since. And it's being played out now as we speak in the courts of the country. Mm-hmm. And eventually we'll end up, I'm sure, at the U.S. Supreme Court. But here in Georgia, we've had a voter ID law now for several years, and it's worked rather well.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you sponsored a bill to provide paper backup to electronic voting.
I did, and what I did specifically was I introduced a bill to do a pilot project to test our voting machines, to make sure that if we did indeed need a paper backup to those electronic voting machines, that we instituted that statewide. The pilot project was done in a North Georgia county and a South Georgia county and one in Middle Georgia, and it turns out that the electronic machines were accurate. That there was no compelling reason to do paper ballots. So the pilot project in that case worked, and now the existing Secretary of State is sticking with the electronic machines, and I would suggest to you that there's a great deal of confidence in those, and that's okay.
So as you look back on that campaign for Secretary of State, would you have done anything differently?
I would have won.
What would it taken to win?
Well, I think in Georgia, well, what would I have done differently? I think I would have talked more about the actual office and plans for the future of that office. I think in politics you get distracted by the present and the past, and we talked about voter ID and we talked about those things, but I would have talked more about how to use the Secretary of State's office for economic development and how to streamline state government and those kinds of things. And I would have done that differently. But a prominent political person that we all know, James Carville, who I once worked with when working with Zell Miller, used to talk about the 4 or 5 M's of politics: money, media, manpower, those kinds of things. And that's still what campaigns are based on these days. Unfortunately, it's hugely expensive, and money is a big decider in politics, and that's always something you wish you could have more of in politics, I guess, when you're running.
So you weren't successful, but you still had a life ahead of you. What happened after that?
Well, I went back to the real world, and I'd spent a number of years in banking growing up, went back to the banking world for a couple of years, and as we speak today, I've taken a position as CEO of the Stone Mountain Authority, and Governor Deal has asked me to take on that as a position, and I have, and it's been great in dealing with Georgia history every day now. And so that's what I did after running for Secretary of State.
Tell us about the Stone Mountain Memorial and the state park there.
Well, it's Georgia's biggest state park. Up to 4 million people visit every year. And it was created, the state park came about in the late 1950s when the Stone Mountain Memorial Association was created with two objectives. One was to provide a place of recreation for Georgians. The other was to provide a memorial for the Confederacy, which has been controversial over time. Today, the mountain and its carving and the antebellum mansions and other things there on the park serve the historical purposes. But now more than ever, it's about recreation and the millions of people that come there every year for just daily recreation and for walking and exercising in the park. It just makes it one of Georgia's great treasures, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Well, it seems that the Georgia Republican Party has a death grip on politics in the state. How long do you think that will continue?
Till somebody messes it up. I think that a death grip is what people think of when they're in the middle of things. There's nothing more inevitable than change in politics and in government. And for 131 years, Democrats were in charge. Republicans are now in charge, and the Republicans think they'll never be out of power either. But unless you're responsive to the needs of the people directly, there's always going to be change in political power in the state. So how long it will last for one party or the other, I don't know. I think in terms of Republican control, there are a couple of things that drove that, including the election of Sonny Perdue, and that is, number one, the demographic changes that came about. Hundreds of thousands of people moving to Georgia into the suburbs and bringing with them some Republican leanings. I think the second thing was there were some mistakes made in redistricting and other things made by the Democrats in power. And those two things combined ended up with Republicans in power, and Republicans will be in power and as long as they are responsive to the needs of Georgia.
You think you'll ever run again?
Not if I can help it. I've loved politics and loved watching it, but I'm very happy now raising 5 sons and watching politics from the sidelines. You learn never to say never in politics, but it would take something extraordinary for me to get into it personally. I just want to help my friends who really feel like they have a calling for public service. And it's a good thing to be able to do that, and I really get enjoyment out of that, and that's how I exercise my need to be politically involved these days.
Paul Coverdale, who was a great Georgia senator, state senator, and the United States senator, used to say that he could hold his Republican caucus in a phone booth.
Yes.
Well, that's not true today. Republicans are outnumbering the Democrats in the legislature every year.
That's right.
And it's growing.
And it grew exponentially during the early 2000s and still growing today. And the Republicans control all the constitutional offices today. But political power, as my friend Zell Miller described to me after he was out of office, political power is a tenuous thing. It's not something that lasts forever. Fame is fleeting. and politics especially. And I think it serves people well who are in political office to realize that it's a temporary trust that people are given by Georgians. And as long as they remember it's a temporary trust and they have to give it back, then they'll serve Georgia well. The day they forget it will be the day that they regret.
Tell us about your 5 sons.
Well, I have 5 sons ranging as of today in age from 26 to 7, and I don't know what I was thinking either, having that big a range. But they're good boys. They're healthy. One of them the oldest one played basketball at the University of Georgia. Very proud of that and the fact that he went to UGA. The second oldest was a defensive tackle at the United States Naval Academy and played football there. And today, as we talk, is assigned to a guided missile cruiser and is serving his country in the Navy. The other 3 are younger and playing baseball and going to school. So proud of them. Every morning when I wake up, the first thing I think of is being a good father, and everything else is second to that.
Well, it's been a great pleasure having you, Bill. Have we forgotten anything?
No, sir, I don't think. I think you've covered most everything worthy of covering.
No more you'd like to say?
No, sir. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.